That's it. That's it. Yeah, there you go. The past few years, I mean, whenever 2020 came around, I was making jokes, and I think everyone else was. 2020, perfect vision. We're going to see everything clearly. Well, we saw a lot of things. Not sure how much of it was clearly, but we saw a lot of things. And even the past year, past couple of years, has just been different as we try to get our footing back from a pandemic, from whatever you want to call it. But as we try to get our footing back, it's just been different. So hopefully, third year's a charm, fourth year's a charm, whatever year it is that we're into this thing, and we start to see things happening again. So 2023, the first service of 2023. I bet Pastor Kelly didn't know she was giving me that service. Didn't think about it. She had a lot of things going on. If you will put up Exodus 14, 10 through 12. We see the children of Israel, they've had their freedom for a few days now, not long, but they've had their freedom for a few days. And they're out in the desert. They've got a sea, the Red Sea, next to them. And they look up and they see Pharaoh approaching. The sons of Israel looked, and behold, the Egyptians were coming after them, and they became very frightened. The only experience they'd had, as far as we can tell, they've seen the plagues. So they've seen 10 times that God has performed something and finally got their freedom. But they haven't had a lot of experience with that. So the sons of Israel cried out, and they said to Moses, "Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you dealt with us in this way, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the word that we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, 'Leave us alone, so that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would be better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness.'" That's pretty depressing. It's a pretty scared group of people. They were sure that they were going to lose their lives out in the middle of nowhere. Pharaoh was mad enough they got 600 chariots. I don't know how many people that would be, but 600 chariots, the horses to go with them. I mean, they stirred up quite a bit of dust as they were riding along there. And it instilled fear in the Israelites. Well, we know the rest of the story. We know that Moses held his hand out. They walked across on dry ground. They didn't get any mud on them. And we know that the Egyptians followed after them, right in the middle of the seabed of the Red Sea, flooring. And as they got in the middle, Moses stretched out his hand again, and God allowed the water to come back together, killing every soldier that had come after him. This also signified that this army, this enemy, they would never see again. God not only delivered them, but you won't have to face this battle again. They're done. That's it. And they're wanting to go back to Egypt. Attitudes changed to more of a party attitude. They started worshiping God. They started singing praises to God because he had delivered them. This time, fully delivered them out of the hands of the Egyptians. But they were quick to accuse Moses of taking them out here so they would die. They were not their background, we'll get into this a little bit later, but their background just didn't pretty much allow them to, their experiences didn't allow them to fully trust God at this point. So that's where we pick up with the Egyptians. The next time, after they've crossed the Red Sea and they've been led by a cloud by day to give them shade so it's not so hot, pillar of fire by night because the nights get cold out in the wilderness to keep them warm. Several other times that they've had to have miracles. They needed water, they needed food, they needed this, they needed that. God met their need every time. Not one time did their needs go unmet. It may not be what they wanted. They got tired of manna. And manna, they walk, God, how are you going to feed us? Well, God says, here it is. You call it manna. Simply means, what is it? We don't know what it was. But whatever it was, what is it? Well, you're going to do this, and this is how you're going to be fed. And they got tired of that. They were pretty much a complaining group of people. They complained about this, they complained about that, and they, just like a lot of us, we can complain pretty well. But they found themselves in a tough spot. So we're going to move to Numbers 14:1. And this is after they had sent the 12 spies into the promised land. They are close to the promised land. They are almost there. And they're not quite sure, so they send some spies into the promised land to scope it out, to see what needs to be done. 10 of them come back out of the 12. 10 of them come back with a negative report. There's giants over there. They'll squash us. We're like grasshoppers in their sight. There's no way that we're going to. These people have seen miracle. At this point, they've seen miracle after miracle, provision after provision. They've had enough time to develop a trust in God. Add on to that the plagues. They've had enough time, but here's their answer after hearing the reports. Two came back and said, we can take the land. God is with us. I don't care how big they are. We can take it. But they listened to the 10. All the congregation raised their voices and cried out, and the people wept that night, and the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The entire congregation, the entire group of Israelites, said to them, if only we had died in the land of Egypt. Really. Or even if we had died in this wilderness. So why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become plunder. Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt? They're this close to the promised land, this close to where God is wanting to take them to. Let's go back to Egypt. Let's appoint a leader. Let's get rid of Moses. They take it a step further. Let's appoint a leader and go back to Egypt. It's not enough to just say go back to Egypt. Let's get us a leader this time to take us back to Egypt. They had seen God work in their behalf many times at this point. Last time, whenever they were crossing the Red Sea, and by the way, some people say, well, it wasn't the Red Sea, it was the Reed Sea. The Reed Sea is close to the Red Sea, and they don't really know where in the Red Sea that they crossed. But the Reed Sea would allow people to cross because it's only only about this deep, so you could cross on it, you know. Forget the part that they crossed on dry ground, you know. But they could cross on that. And someone else said, well, I guess that's just as big a miracle. And they said, what do you mean? Well, if the Reed Sea's only this deep and the entire Egyptian army drowned, that's a pretty good miracle too. But I do believe that they crossed on dry ground, and I do believe that the Egyptian army was covered. And they've actually, some architects, not architects, but boy, that's wrong. Archaeologists, thank you, have actually found a place in the Red Sea where there's chariots and bodies. And they said they brought out 400, but they said there are many more bodies down there. And people still make up reasons why the Bible's not true. But archaeologists have found it. It's not me saying that. That's archaeologists that have found that. But at the Red Sea, they didn't have quite as much experience with God. This time they had the experience, and this time there are consequences. Anyone over the age of 20, the whole Egyptian or Israelite people, anyone over the age of 20 now will not go into the promised land because of their disbelief, their disobedience and their disbelief, their unbelief. After God had done all that he's done for them, he's not going to allow anyone over the age of 20 to go in, with the exception of Joshua, Caleb, and Moses. Joshua and Caleb were the two spies that came back with a good report that says, we can take it. And so God says, you two can go in. Everyone else is going to have to die. Thus the 40 years wandering around in the wilderness, waiting on people to die, basically. Once everyone had died, then they could go in. And I'm not going to focus on going into the promised land tonight. But what I am going to focus on is why, after God has done all of that for them, would they even entertain the idea of going back to Egypt? Is Egypt that bad of a place? I mean, it is for them. It's slavery. They had been enslaved for 400 years at the point where they found their freedom, at the point where Moses comes back into the picture. And God works miracle after miracle after miracle to get them freedom. They had been enslaved for 400 years. Now, understand this is not the time before the flood where people are living 5, 6, 7, 800 years. Moses lived to be 120. Miriam, his sister, lived to be 126. Aaron, his brother, lived to be 123. And Joshua lived to be 110. Their whole life, they had been captive. Their parents' whole life, they'd been captive. Their grandparents' whole life, they had been slaves. They had been forced to do whatever the Egyptians wanted them to do. They were used to that. They were comfortable with being a slave. They were not comfortable with this newfound freedom. They were not comfortable with not knowing what was going to happen. They knew as a slave, someone would come, wake them up in the morning, or they knew they had to be ready at a certain time if they weren't woke up, or they'd get beat. They knew that if they did not do what was expected, that there was a punishment coming, whether it was beaten with a whip or whatever it was. The taskmasters that they had knew how to get them to work, to do what had to be done. And if it meant using a whip, they would. If it meant withholding something from them, they would do that. If it meant threatening their children, they would do that. Whatever it would take, they would do. And they were used to this. It's all that they knew their whole life. Their entire lives, their parents' entire lives, their grandparents' entire life, they were slaves. And because it was what they were familiar with, because it was what they were comfortable with, they were willing to leave what God had in store for them and go back into that. In your life, you're going to face challenges. You're going to face hard times. The question is, do you go forward with God, or do you fall back to the comfortable, to the familiar? Now, they had said that God said anyone above the age of 20 would not see the promised land. And that's interesting because in my college days, my big college career of 1 quarter, that's how long it took for me to bail. But I did take a course in psychology. And while this was written probably 4,000 years or so ago, and he says over 20, psychologists back in the 80s were telling us that by the time you turn 20, you're set in your ways for life. By the time you turn 20, that's how you're going to be the rest of your life. With the exception of if you lose a close loved one, you may make some changes in your life then. If you have a severe accident and you lose a limb or you're somehow challenged in some way, that may change you. Or, and this is their words, a deep religious experience can change your life. Other than those things, there's a few other things that they mentioned as well. But for the most part, whenever you hit 20, that's where you are the rest of your life. And I guess it didn't change over those thousands of years because God said, you're over 20, you made your decision, you want to stay in Egypt, well, you're not going to see the promised land. You're not going to get to go back to Egypt either, but you're not going to see the promised land. Now, what I've just told you about the 400 years in slavery, the exception to that was Moses. Now, he was an Israelite, but he grew up in the palace. Not only did he grow up in the palace, he didn't grow up in the palace as a worker. He grew up in the palace as a member of the royal family, as a member of Pharaoh's family. He had servants. He had the best of everything. He had the best food, the best education, the best of the best. He wasn't your typical, he wasn't raised even as your typical Israelite, or Egyptian rather, but he was raised inside the palace. He was raised as a member of the royal family. What made the difference with him is the first 3 or 4 years of his life, Pharaoh's daughter couldn't nurse him. So she found a Israelite woman, and it happened to be his mom. I don't know if they knew that or if they just picked randomly, but it happened to be his mother to nurse him. And during those, I believe, and I can't prove this, I truly can't prove it, but I believe during those first 3.5, 4 years of his life while he's nursing, his mom's telling him, you're going to be somebody. You are an Egyptian. This is your God, and he can do this, this, and this. And taught during the first 3.5 years probably the most formative years in a person's life, because you go from knowing nothing to learning languages to learning. And I think a lot of things get set during the first 3.5 years that will affect you the rest of your life. And for him, it allowed him at the time that he needed to say, hey, I'm going to side with them because that's my people. And he walked away from everything that you could ever want. If he wanted it, he had it. He didn't have to. He could have said, well, I'm not really worried about them because that really doesn't affect me. The way that they're being treated really doesn't affect me because I'm a member of the royal family. So what that I'm not Egyptian? Neither was Joseph an Egyptian. And he rose to the number 2 position. But those were different times. The people were not enslaved. The Israelites were not enslaved under Joseph. It was not until later a new Pharaoh came, and he was afraid that the Israelites were growing too big, and so he's the one that enslaved them after Joseph's time, after Joseph had passed away. So Pharaoh enslaved them, and for 400 years kept the people enslaved, and it's all that they knew. Some of us in here we're at a point where you've either broken away from the familiar, or you're in a stage where you're in a familiar, you're in a comfortable place. There is nothing wrong with being comfortable. There's nothing wrong with being familiar. We become familiar with each other. That's how we become friends. Okay? Nothing in the world, that's the way that's supposed to work. We become familiar with an area so that we know it like the back of our hand, so that we don't get lost. We know where we're going. Nothing wrong with that. It's when the familiar keeps us from moving to where God wants us to move. If that cloud's moving, I want to be moving. If God's moving, I want to go where he tells me to go. If it's standing still, I want to stand still. If God goes, I want to go. If he stays, I want to stay. I don't want to go anywhere without him. But if my familiarity gets to a place where, God, you got this, you can go, then my familiarity, my comfortableness is dangerous. Whatever your comfort level is, whatever your comfort place is. And at what age does that turn off? It doesn't. It doesn't stop whenever you turn 60. It doesn't stop whenever you turn 80. You need God, and you need his provisions. You need his blessings. Now, I included Moses at that point. Moses was still in line to go see the promised land. But due to some disobedience that he had in his life later on, God said, you're not going to enter the promised land. He allowed him to see it, but he couldn't enter it. And then he died before going into the promised land. So even he didn't get to see it. He led the children of Israel for 40 years around waiting for people to die. Basically, that's what they were doing, is waiting for the 20 and up group to die while they were running around. And God was still meeting their needs. God was still supplying their needs. But they just couldn't go in until everyone had died that was over the age of 20. Egypt was familiar. It was so familiar to them. They knew when they had to get up, when they could go to sleep, what they had to do. They had trouble following God because the freedom was new. How many of y'all would rather be in slavery than have freedom? Me neither. Freedom is nice, but freedom does bring some unexpected possibilities. Freedom does bring choices that we wouldn't have as a slave. As a slave, you don't make any decisions. They're made for you. In freedom, you make your decisions. We've talked about the children of Israel. Let's talk about today, though. Do we do the same thing? Mainly women, but not always. But mainly women will be in an abusive relationship. They'll get out only to go back into it because it's familiar. Oh, we can make it work this time. We'll tell ourselves all kinds of lies. We can make it work this time. And it might be better for a little while, but unless there's something that changes, it's going to go back and probably be worse than it was. But we see that time and time again. We see people who are addicted to things, no matter what it is, whether it be drugs, alcohol, you name it, TV, digital stuff. We see it all the time. People get away from their addictions, and they're living a life of freedom, and they either hit a hard part, a difficult time, or something, and they go back into it, into that form of slavery, whatever the addiction is. Foster kids, yanked out of a home where they're being abused, placed in a home where the family is willing to help them. And yeah, I know, I'm not going to get into it. I know not all foster homes are great, but I want to believe that for the most part they're wanting to help people. But because it's unfamiliar to them, they'd rather be back home where they were getting beat than in this new home where they're safe. And it takes a while. And some of the foster kids never adapt to that. They suffer the loss of their family. That's a major loss. So they misbehave and they're moved to another family. And they misbehave and they move to another family. 3 or 4 losses of families. And soon, I'm going to take care of myself. No one else is going to do it. No one cares for me. I'm passed around. I'm just... because they were familiar with their family. They love their family. For the most part, there's some that are older and realize they needed to get out, but sometimes they never realize that they needed to get out. We see it with foster kids. Even us, and I don't know, some of you may be going through something, but even us in a normal, quote unquote normal, whatever that entails, life can get so comfortable that whenever God calls us to do something and we hit a hard spot, we go back to the comfortableness instead of saying, God, how did I get through this hard spot? We go back, well, it must not have been God because it didn't happen. And we go back to our comfortable seats. And we sit down and we continue to play church. I don't know if that's what it would be called. I asked you earlier, how many of you felt like God had something better for you? Almost all of you raised your hands. If God's got something better for you, it will probably involve change. We don't like change. For the most part, people don't like change for various reasons and some good reasons. But if God's got something better for you, something will change. If it doesn't change, then it's not better. It's the same old, same old. Zig Ziglar used to say there's a price to be paid for success. He used to say, people say there's a price to be paid for success. He said, but the reality is there's a price to be paid for failure. You don't pay the price for success, you gain the benefits for success. You pay the price for not pursuing the success or the plan that God has for you. That's where you pay the price. Whenever I was in full-time ministry, I got a call one night. And it was this young lady, a young couple. She said, Tim, I need you to go find my husband. I said, okay. I said, what's going on? She said, well, we got in an argument tonight. We were in the car and we got in an argument and he hit me. And he felt sorry. He was very sorrowful, but he left. I said, okay. He was a good friend of mine, so I knew some places he might be, and it didn't take me long to find him. Called up with him and talked to him, told him that his wife had called me, wanted me to find him and talked to him about what happened. He was very remorseful. Said he'd never done it before. He really didn't mean to that time. He just reached back and he did. He hit her. And talked to the wife, and she'd already told me, she said, it's never happened before. I do want him to come home. So, took him home. She confirmed. Never happened before. We set up a counseling appointment the next day, the next afternoon. The next morning, I got a call from her mother. You got to follow this now. She's mad. Rightfully so. Rightfully so. But her reasoning, me and my husband fight all the time, regularly. He has even put my head through a sheetrock wall, but he never blackened my eye. This couple, the lady, ended up with a black eye. Whenever he did this, a ring caught, and it caused her to have a black eye. This mother's more concerned about the black eye than the fight in the first place. So we get into the counseling session, and we're talking, and again it comes up that that's the only time he's ever hit her in the 3, 4, 5 years that they've been married at that point. Now, I didn't know his mother or her mother before that phone call. I'd never met her mother, never met her side of the family at that point. But his parents came to church. I knew them. And it was brought up that, yeah, that's the only time. And then she says, but I really expect him to do it more because I hit him almost every day. And it took me back. I'm sorry, can you repeat that? I want to make sure I heard it right. She repeated it, and I'd heard it right. So, I'm surprised he hasn't hit me more because I hit him every day almost. You see, she was behaving from the familiarness of her parents. Her parents fought each other, physically fought each other, threw things at each other, and it was a regular basis. I don't know if it was every day, but it was several times a week. So she is acting out of what she knows. This is regular. This is a family. This is how you be a family. You fight. We did have to talk to her and say, no, that's not normal. He wasn't going to say anything. How many of you know of a man that's going to say, my wife's abusing me? I mean, but he didn't leave. He stayed with her all those years, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, whatever it was. Well, it was more than 2, but 3, 4, 5 years at that point. He never mentioned it, never told me about it. And he didn't leave. And so we were able to show her that, no, that's not a normal family. You grew up in an abnormal family. Fortunately, there was no child abuse. Their parents just fought each other and left the kids alone. But, and we gave her some tools to, rather than hit him, do this or try this or whatever. As far as I know, they're doing well today, but it's what you're familiar with. You don't know. You think it's normal. How many of y'all remember the Little Rascals? Trying to think of the main guy's name now. Usually I got it. Spanky. He used to go out, get in the car every morning. He saw the other kids getting in their cars. And he said, I thought they were going to work like me. Whenever I found out they were going to school, I quit work. It was what he was familiar with. He thought that everyone did it. He thought that was normal. He broke the cycle. He said, whenever I realized that wasn't normal, I decided I wasn't going to be an actor anymore, at least for a little while. I don't know if he ever got back into it or not, but it's what you're used to, and what you're used to is not always the norm. But it is normal for you. It is normal for you. We come together. I don't think any of us have a background in slavery unless it's the new slavery. Some of you might have a background in human trafficking, and that's sad. And I'm so sorry if you have, and I hope that nothing I've said tonight triggers anything. But some of you, we come from different backgrounds. Even if we come from a background where we grew up in church, we probably grew up in different churches. Miss Ann, you said you grew up in a Lutheran church, is that right? See, I didn't grow up in a Lutheran church, so even we would have some differences. And not that they're bad, they're just different. But if you took all of us in here, none of us came back. I doubt that any of us came from a similar, real similar background. So we all see things as normal that probably are different. But how do we come together? Again, 95 to 100% of us raised our hand and said that God's got something better. So how do we come together and become willing to leave the familiar to reach the promised land? To fulfill what God has in store for you, what He had planned from the very beginning of time. You say, I can't do it, it's too big. You probably can't do it if it's from God. You probably will have to rely on His help. The children of Israel couldn't cross the Red Sea, and they sure couldn't cross it on dry ground. But they couldn't have crossed it if they'd have jumped in the Red Sea. They had to have some help. So one of the things that we've got to do is realize that we've got to have help. Some of that help will come, all of it will come from God, but understand some of it will come directly from God and some of it will come from us. If you're struggling with something, Christianity is one of the world's worst. How you doing? How you doing, Jack? Good. And that's the response that 99% of the people will give, even if they're going through it. Even if they are living the dream, and the dream's a nightmare. They're going to reply, doing good, doing good. Christianity is probably the world's worst place where we lie because no one really cares anyway. We should have, I'm not saying blab all your troubles to everybody. I'm not saying that either, because you really will lose friends, okay, if that's what you do. But you should have some close friends who are Christian that you can share what you're going through. Share your happiness with and share your sorrows with. You see, shared happiness is double joy. If they're really your friend, if you got that promotion, they are right there with you, and it's double joy. And shared grief is halved. They'll hold you up. They'll take part of that grief and they'll hold you up. This is what we should be doing. People need help getting from point A to point B. And if you say you don't, then you're a liar. And if you say you don't, why aren't you there yet? If you don't need help, why aren't you there yet? Loving people, as good as that is, and we have to do it, but loving people won't change people. God loved the children of Israel from the Red Sea. Well, let me go back. God loved them from slavery to the Red Sea to the Promised Land. And it wasn't enough to change them. But we do still love. We still got to love them, but it won't, don't get me wrong, it won't be enough to change some people. You still got to love them. Look at how hard it is for you to change something about yourself. If it's that hard for you to change something about yourself, forget about you trying to change someone else, because you can't do it, and you won't do it, and they won't change. Sometimes I can't change myself. A lot of things it's been God dragging me on my bottom, just dragging me as I fight to the place He wants me to be. And I can still get up from that place and walk right back to where I was if I choose to. But we can show people love, and we've got to figure out. The Bible, well, first off, we've got to figure out how to love one another. That's another fault of the church right now, is that we don't know how to love each other. So why should the world listen to us? Why should they listen to us? So if we love one another and we love them, and we've got to, we don't love them to change them, okay? Don't love people to change people. It's been said about marriages, a woman marries to change the man into a better person, and a man marries thinking the woman will never change. Okay, neither of which is true. She can't change the man. Someone said she can't change the man unless he's in diapers. Okay, maybe then she can change him, but. You don't love someone to change them. You love someone because you love them. And God's love wasn't enough to change the Egyptians. How's your love? How's our imperfect love going to be enough to change someone, but we still love them. We love each other and we love them. Miracles. How many of y'all have seen a miracle? Not just heard about miracles, but you've seen miracles. I've seen miracles. I have prayed for people with cancer and they go back to the doctor and there's no sign of cancer. I have seen other miracles where other people have prayed for different things. While miracles will be a sign for some that God is able to do things, it's still not enough to change them. The children of Israel saw miracle after miracle, provision after provision, that you cannot, you hit a rock and water comes out enough for the whole children of Israel. I could hit a rock all day long. The difference is God said hit the rock and water flowed out. He tells me to hit a rock, I'll hit a rock and whatever happened to happen, but he hasn't told me to hit any rocks. Just like some people say, well, if he told you to pick that snake up, would you? Well, he hadn't told me to pick up any snakes. And so, no, I'm not going to. The most we can do is live our lives following God's example, serving others and serving God and then serving others. And if they see our example and they feel our love, that it's been said that the only way that people will change, they have to see the advantages of leaving the familiar and coming over here. They have to see that there's more advantages over here than there is over here, or they're going to stay the same, especially after they turn 20. That's why you see so many, that's why, and they've done studies on it, but like 85% of the people who come to Christ come to Christ before they're 18. And out of that 85%, and this is me talking, I want to say probably 70% of those come before they're 12. The older you get, the less the percentage rate. Someone my age has like a 5% chance if they haven't already given their heart to God. Why? Because we're set in our ways. Does that mean we don't reach out to the adults? No, we reach out to the adults, we reach out to the kids, we reach out to everybody. But it's easier to tell a child about God because they've got childlike faith. By the time you get to be an adult, you've seen a lot of things, and they ain't all pretty. And you wonder how there could even be a God. But we've got to be willing to let go of the familiar. And I may be talking to myself and no one else, I don't know. But if God really has something for you, then something's got to change or it's not better. It's the same old, same old. I'm not saying it's got to be a drastic change, but something has to change. And you got to be willing to let go of the familiar and reach out, take hold of what he's got next for you. And a lot of times, it's what he's got next for you, and then as you grab that and that becomes familiar, it's what he's got next for you after that. And what he's got next for you after that. Because as long as you're breathing, as long as you're up and about. In fact, I know a man grew up, and he was in the church I grew up in. He got to where he couldn't get out very much, very often at all. But he still reached out to people. He still was able to find it somehow to reach out and to give a word to people and to lift people up. So I guess even if you can't get out, God's still not done with you. So.